Сайн байцгаана уу хүн үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр манай Defacto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор олон улсын Community of Democracies буюу Ардчиллын төлөө нэгдэл. Энэ байгууллагын Ерөнхий нарийн бичгийн дарга ТОМАС Гаррет оролцож байна.
ТОМАС Гаррет Ардчилсан орнуудын хамтын нийгэмлэгийн Ерөнхий нарийн бичгийн дарга. ТОМАС Гаррет улс төр түүний эрх чөлөөг хамгаалах чиглэлээр 30 гаруй жил ажилласан тэрээр 2000 онд бүгд найрамдагчдын хүрээлэнгийн Улаанбаатар дахь байнгын зөвлөх Хойд Америк зүүн Аз хариуцсан бүсийн захирал зэрэг албан тушаалыг хашиж байжээ. ТОМАС Гаррет нь дипломатиос олон улсын харилцаа, улс төрийн шинжлэх ухааны чиглэлээр суралцаж төгссөн. Монгол улсын засгийн газраас түүнийг Монголын ардчиллын төлөө оруулсан хувь нэмрийг нь үнэлэн найрамдлын одонгоор 2017 онд шагнажээ.
Please tell us what brought you now this time to Mongolia. And that's, by the way, how many times you are coming to Mongolia?
Well, I've made maybe a half dozen trips to Mongolia.
Dozen trips.
Since 1999.
Okay.
And so it's been wonderful to come back time and again, see old friends, but also make new friends. What brings me this time is a conference that the Community of Democracies, the Asia Development Network, and the Asia Development Alliance are putting on here in Ulaanbaatar. We're bringing people from across Asia to talk about sustainability, especially in regards to the UN Sustainable Development Agenda 2030. And so we have people from a dozen or so countries in Asia here with us today talking about what they're doing to fulfill their commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Which part of the Sustainable Development? Because it is quite broad actions and quite appealing, quite dynamic goals. Which part of it?
So we're looking especially at Sustainable Development Goals 16, which is concerning just, inclusive, and peaceful institutions. I think for the Community of Democracies, we would have liked to have seen democracy more explicitly written into the Sustainable Development Agenda. But I think if you look at Sustainable Development Goal 16, you can see where democracy belongs. And that is, there really is no development without peace, and there's no peace without development. And we really see that as a part of what democracy is about.
Exactly. And it's, of course, very noble idea of having the institutions in the place. That's what is Mongolia. We are kind of missing. We don't have serious institutions as political parties or as political parties as a serious institutions. And you, one of the persons who, friend of Mongolia, our democracy, you were for a certain time a rep of IRI in Mongolia before you go to Indonesia. Today, from say 20 years almost. Let's wrap up 20 years of Mongolia in the context of the institutions.
I think, as I think back to the year 1999 when I first arrived, the year 2000 when I stayed in your country working with the political parties, I think perhaps we didn't realize, both those of us from the outside and those of you here within your country, how very long it takes for institutions to develop. I think we were probably optimistic, and that optimism was born of sort of the Mongolian zeal that we saw during your revolution. But institutions take a very long time, and I think we're still seeing institutions develop here, and we're seeing institutions develop at a time when there's great change in the world. And so a combination of factors have meant perhaps things have moved more slowly than we might have thought in the year 2000, but I still think things are moving on the right trajectory.
In particular, when you said the peace and democracy, they goes together, and development. And development goes there where democracy is, peace is. And when we talk about democracies, now we have now a new challenge, which is corruption. And I understand it's all around the world, but in particular this young democracy where We had not much own capital before. It's quite a young democratic country. So how do you see that the institutions' capacity and corruption, in particular the corruption perception index, we are not in the best place and not improving much. So how do you see that?
Well, as you mentioned, corruption is a great challenge in almost every country. The difference is in some countries, corruption is dealt with effectively and actually is punished. In the United States, we still see politicians and others go to prison for corruption. It's moving to that issue of impunity, where the people no longer accept corruption, where the voters, where the citizens say, corruption is impacting my family and my life in a very negative way. It's no longer just people at the top taking money that belong to others. It actually has a direct input on my life as far as poor quality of health delivery, poor schools, poor public infrastructure, because this money is being siphoned away. It really does come down to, I think, civil society and the voters of a country to decide when enough is enough.
And when you think, not to have the people, the voters say enough is enough, at which point first it comes, and how we can do that it happens earlier?
Well, and I think political will is a critical part of this. You really do need to find someone who's decided, I'm going to make a break with the way things have been done. And I think at times through your country's history, as well as in the history of my home country, the United States, we have seen individuals willing to stand against the status quo and to say, we have to break this cycle, but you need political will. And without political will, it's very, very hard for institutions to make a difference on corruption.
Exactly. And we in particular find today, after 30 years, trying to build democracy. It is actually, compared to many countries, it's democracy. It's a freedom of speech, and that's a good chance. That very fact, you and me talk about things straight away, right? And that's very important. And now we in Mongolia at this level of kind of learning or maturity, if you wish, we need deeply knowing that we must act upon corruption. And then we find today that the source of corruption is coming from the secrecy of the political party, their campaign financing and their own operation financing. That's the fact that now there are even certain cases that bring big problem to ruling party, for example. They were trying to sell public offices, positions, for the total sum of 60 billion 2 weeks before election, for example. This kind of scandal. The audio recording was revealed and broadcasted. It cost now the speaker removed. He was removed. So how can we, the society, also the members of the political parties, can stop that secrecy of financing?
Well, again, it requires action on behalf of the public. It requires political will among politicians who will make a break with corruption. I would say that technology provides us the opportunity to do good things. Sometimes we speak often about how technology has brought some bad things into our democratic systems. But technology in and of itself gives us the opportunity to, for instance, put all public contributions out for any person to access and to read. It allows us to say, you may give as much money as the law allows, but it's instantly recorded and instantly put into the public record through technology. I believe still what's going to happen. I'm an optimist. I still believe civil society, reformers within the political parties, certain politicians who want a better future for the country are going to be able to work together one day and take advantage of things like new technology to try to fight corruption. But something you've said I do want to make a point about, and that is the battle against corruption is never over. It is always ongoing. It really is, again, the response of the institutions. It's the response of the government to corruption. But corruption occurs. That is just something we fight in every democracy at every stage of development.
You have been about over a dozen countries being election observer, and you have worked yourself extensively on ARR programs in many countries, Asia, Indonesia, where, I mean, it also not the zero corruption, of course. So how does the technology can, for example, do you have particular cases to mention?
Well, for instance, there is a civil society initiative in South Asia that's entitled I Paid a Bribe. Mm-hmm. And when a citizen finds themselves forced to pay a bribe, perhaps a small one or perhaps a large one, they can actually go and they can post that onto this website, and it brings light, it brings exposure to this case of bribery. You can also, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, you can have wealthy people give money to political parties. Perhaps that's allowed under the Constitution. But one of the things that it should be is it should never be done in secrecy. It should always be done, again, with technology. There is no reason with blockchain technology, it is not posted within 24 hours of delivery of this money. So that the public knows this political party has received money from this individual with this individual's interest. In the United States, again, our court has found that part of free speech is the ability to give large sums of money, if you are able to politicians. But what we have to strengthen is we have to strengthen the disclosure laws.
Speaking about the disclosure laws, please tell us how practically we can, how does it work? Can we have special law? What is the best way?
Well, I think, again, the best way is to have a set of principles that's probably perhaps executive branch origin regulations, or perhaps a piece of legislation, or both, working together. But you need to have this spelled out so that it is clear that when one injects money into the political system, one should expect that to be totally transparent and fully accountable.
It is, yeah. And so there should be a particular law on disclosure of financing or donating to the political parties. The issue here in Mongolia, because the executive branch and the legislature and justice, they have so much intervened, combined, and there is certainly even the impression that they don't work upon by law. They work our justice system like work by signal. That's the concern. So where to start? How to stop that this interconnections chains?
Well, I feel like one of the strengths of Mongolian democracy, one of the persistent strengths of Mongolia's democracy, is the freedom of your media, the freedom of public expression. As you mentioned, we're able to speak about these things openly and without fear, and that's not true in many countries. In many countries, just speaking, even in guarded terms about these issues, might land one in serious trouble with authorities. Mongolia has a very strong record of media freedoms, social media rights for individuals. That's the technology I'm referring to. Take that and publicize instances where one believes the public has a right to know. And I think this is the way to move forward.
That's what the media is trying. However, the result, for example, according to the party financing, political parties law, current one, they are suggesting new one, having into consideration all this stuff we talked. But they don't even discuss in the parliament that new draft law of political parties. How to get them discussing. Now probably they are coming close, but when the politicians, when they see the laws, touching their interests, they're usually very reluctant going forward. How, again, the same work through media?
Through public exposure, through public discourse. In the United States, in the 1990s, two politicians from two different parties came together to create campaign finance reform. And it severely changed the ability of the very wealthy to give large sums of money. And it equalized everyone. That law stood for a few years, and then our Supreme Court determined it actually was a violation of free speech. And so today what we see in the United States...
But they have abolished that law too.
Yes, and now we suddenly see large sums of money being given by individuals.
What
incredibly large sums of money.
Who are these people? What's the name?
So the original legislation was called McCain-Feingold.
Again?
McCain, John McCain.
John McCain was the man.
And Russ Feingold, a Democratic senator, and McCain, a Republican senator. And so McCain-Feingold meant to impact the ability of money to influence elections. But again, our Supreme Court determined that our Constitution's free speech provisions meant that an individual could exercise free speech by giving $1 million or more. And so today we find people who give, wealthy people who give tens of millions of dollars annually into the political process. The Supreme Court has said they have the right to do that. I think now we have to not say, well, that's that. We have to say, then how do we ensure that it's done as legally as possible?
When they have abolished that law?
It was more than a decade ago.
So it worked about also a decade ago? I mean, for 1 decade or so?
Well, for a period of time, there were much more stringent regulations, and then those have been removed by this court decision. That doesn't mean you stop. That means you, all right, you take the court decision and you look at other aspects of accountability and transparency. It's a constant struggle.
Why would the law, Constitutional Court?
The Supreme Court.
Your Supreme Court is kind of our Constitutional Court, right?
Probably. Yeah.
So how come the Supreme Court, considering giving them money, and if this expression of your will, your speech, and then why they would not consider this part, where they are buying it, they are the buying of the politicians?
You would have to go back and look at the original court decision. I don't recall the rationale they used, except to say that they believe free speech protections under the US Constitution extend to campaign donations.
So now that means in the US, you can give any amount of money to any political party, whatever you want, and only thing you need to declare, right, or not?
It is supposed to be publicly disclosed.
Publicly disclosed.
And it is, and that's one of the safeguards that remains in place.
Yeah, and now public knows that this company, corporation, or that
this
individual paid, say, $20 million to a guy.
A party or to a, yes.
Who will follow whether this money come with something attached to it or not? In the process, after they get money, will they make any law or any favor for those who give? Who is following that?
And that is the role of the media as a watchdog, but that's also the role of civil society. And so we have very strong civil society organizations in the United States that publicize on their website, here is a large amount of money given during the election, and here's a decision by a government body later, which would seem to indicate, you know, it's very difficult to prove there's a direct correlation, but it does bring that to the public's attention.
Another question, early 90s, when I went to the US with Mongolian Petroleum Mission, and there were officially lobby groups who wanted to meet us. Some of them met, and they were suggesting they will lobby the support of the US government. And they were explaining, and that's my impression later on, you have this lobby group, law, de facto, they're existing. How is the situation now? You spent many years also in DC. You were also close to the George, Senior Bush, right?
I worked in that government.
In that government.
Long ago.
Yes. So please tell us, what is the lobby about, how it is legal and how it is today?
Well, I think in the U.S. system, the way citizens impact their government is usually through organized groups. And so Americans like to join organizations, and they like to join forces. And so lobbying is, I know in many countries, always had a bit of a negative connotation. But in the United States, I think lobbying is considered a acceptable and legal form of impacting the political process. But we have laws concerning that. We have laws concerning what lobbyists are able to do, what lobbyists, they must declare, for instance, their interest. They can't pretend to represent widows and orphans while they're actually working on petroleum or minerals. You have to be very honest about why you're there and what you hope to achieve.
Are they usually lawyers?
I think very often that's useful, but not always. Some may be former politicians. Some may be school teachers who rose up through the system to become head of trade unions. It could be any number of people.
Early 90s probably also because there were no social media at that time, right?
Yes.
And at times, say, a trade union want to have somebody in DC to express their interests at the time, whatever is needed, right? So that the strength of the lobby culture is still there?
Yes, I think so. And I think it's even more important now because legislation in the United States is very complex. It is not a simple 12-page document.
I know.
It's hundreds and hundreds of pages at times. And so it does require hearing from various interests. You hear from the corporate interests that will be impacted. You hear from the citizens who have a desire or an aspiration. You hear from other government agencies that must regulate this industry. There's a number of different interests that come together, and they do that openly, and I think that's the important part of this. They do this openly.
Let's talk a bit about the community of democracies. When was it established, and why, and how is things going now?
And so in the year 2000, 106 countries came together in Warsaw, Poland, with the idea of examining democracy. And the standard by which these countries were invited was, are you on a democratic path? Perhaps you're at the early stage. Have you had an election? Is democracy where you are trying to move? And so 106 countries came to Warsaw, and it was determined at the time that democracy is not one single model, but there's great diversity in democracy. But while at the same time, the countries that gathered in 2000 agreed there's great diversity in democracy, they also agreed there are basic principles that if you say you are a democracy, you must believe in. And so these countries together drafted something called the Warsaw Declaration. And those are 19 principles of democracy and human rights that if a country, if a system says we are a democracy, they really must adhere to. Mongolia was one of the original countries to attend and signed this Warsaw Declaration in the year 2000.
And since that, how often they meet, how the results, how do you find the results today after about 20 years almost? Almost
20 years. And so the community of democracies meets every 2 years at a ministerial. A ministerial was held here, for instance, in Ulaanbaatar a few years ago, during the Mongolian presidency of the community of democracies. So every 2 years there's a ministerial gathering. The last ministerial gathering was in Washington, D.C. in 2017, and more than 145 countries participated. And issues of democracy, issues of human rights were discussed, and a Washington Declaration was issued. Just as at the ministerial in Mongolia, there was an Ulaanbaatar Declaration, which is on our website. when democratic countries come together, I think very good things can happen. And it can be determined that, again, human rights need to take a priority. Or, and this is something I think in reference to the conversation we've just had, I think more and more we're looking at the issues of inequality, and we're looking at the issues of wealth distribution. We also are looking, I think, more as democracies at the issue of the environment. But these are all important issues, and there is a democratic response to all of them.
Let's touch one of them, which is how you're going to address wealth distribution issue combined with inequality. Well,
I think something that we've learned over 19 years at the Community of Democracies is that democracy cannot be an abstract thought. It cannot only be a philosophy, it actually has to deliver. Democracy that delivers. And if one lives in a democratic country, I think a citizen has the right to expect certain basic standards are met concerning health care, education, safety for girls and women, freedom of journalists. And so it's something that, once again, I've said this more than once, and I really do believe this, it's never finished. We are always looking for how to improve a democracy.
And they're
always developing, and they're all at different stages of development.
So when the talk comes about certain expectation of certain standard medical care services, education, which is not any more discussions of whether it is government job or not, looks like it is, and now it's a matter of quality here in particular. But on the other hand, the wealth that is being distributed by the government, wealth that is taxed by the government to need to be spent for this kind of services providing. But however, at times, like in Mongolia, the government is under the name of inequality raising and all this. Then they are raising taxes, yet they are increasing their own expenses. How to combat that?
Well, the question how is an important question. Probably another important question is whether or not to challenge. That's what's important. There is a different answer probably for different countries and different democracies. But the question is, do we ignore or do we address this? And I think democracies are finding more and more they have to address this. It's a very new world than it was even just a few years ago. Today, we can find maybe a few dozen individuals have more money themselves than many countries around the world put together.
But
it's a very different world than it used to be.
However, they earned the money.
And they did earn the money, and they earned it through, very often, democratic systems of economy. And so, but that's something we have to look at. We have to look at does it remain an open process for everyone to rise, or is the gap between the top and the bottom becoming so great that there's no longer any movement?
Here, one option here is people earning, those who is illegally earning wealth, they should be punished. Those who is legally earning the wealth should have certain incentives in the form of tax exemption, for example, when they give, because they don't need much anyway, right? If they decide to give, it's a voluntarily decisions. That person giving, say, 10, 20, 30 even % to the people. And then you had, many democracies have a law exempting that, rewarding him for doing that, which is not the case in Mongolia. How can we provoke that sense of humanity?
Well, the Community of Democracies is founded again on the idea that there's diversity within democracies. And so I can tell you that some of our member states pursue a heavy form of taxation. Others pursue a very low degree of taxation. Some have highly confiscatory positions about wealth, others don't. And there is not one right answer. There is something different for every system at its stage of development. That's why the Warsaw Declaration, I think, has stood the test of 19 years, is that it doesn't prescribe specific policies, but it has basic principles of human rights and democracy. One of those basic rights of democracy, for instance, is there should be equal access to all citizens to the law, not just to the wealthy. And so that is something I think any democracy must agree is important. But you can still have differences within those democracies concerning taxation, economic policy,
Sure.
jobs creation.
Last question, since your organization is based in Warsaw, and yet in Warsaw, in Hungary and Poland and Czech Republic, strong, kind of even more political powers who are completely resisting immigrations to come to their countries rather than Western, more developed democracies. How is it going to be in near future?
You know, again, I think if you take a long-term look at democracy, don't look at 3 years of a current government, but look at 3 decades since independence or 3 decades since a revolution. And I think you'll find democracies are resilient. And so if you look at elections, if you look at media freedoms, I think the countries that you've mentioned, as well as many others around the world, they have a high degree of freedom within the country, and they have elections this year, next year, or the year after. And things could be very, very different. I know in the United States, we see a very different political scene in 2019 than we did in 2017, as we now see a new United States House of Representatives, which is made up of new people. And so democracies have the key to resilience. Democracies have the key within to self-correct. And I would just encourage, again, a long-term look at democracy rather than a very short term of 12 months, 2 years, a longer look.
Okay. Well, that was a great pleasure.
It's good to see you.
In particular to learn, to talk to you, because you have seen all these countries in change. You remember 20 years ago, what is it, how is today? But I found very optimistic tone in your
I hope so.
interview, and let's end with this optimistic tone our interview, and I wish you good luck in your what
Thank
you
you.
do.
Good luck to the Institute.
Thank you very much. Thank you. За, хүн үзэгчдээ өнөөдөр манай Defacto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор энэ олон улсын энэ Community of Democracies гэж ардчилын төлөө нэгдэл гэсэн энэ байгууллагын ерөнхий нарийн бичгийн дарга ТОМАС Гаррет оролцлоо. Баярлалаа.